Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast exploring storytelling on film, as well as interviews with industry professionals who work in film, television, theater, and other areas of the arts. I want to welcome to the show Adam Nayman, who is a Toronto-based critic, author, and lecturer. He teaches cinema studies at the University of Toronto and is a contributing editor to CinemaScope. He reviews films for The Ringer, Sight and Sound, and Little White Lies. His books include It Doesn't Suck, Showgirls, The Coen Brothers. This book really ties the films together. Ben Wheatley, Confusion and Carnage. David Fincher, Mind Games. And the book we're talking about today is also a recent book of his, Paul Thomas Anderson's Masterworks. Adam, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
I just wanted to say off the top, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really, really love the book. It's such an enriching experience, and it answered a lot of questions I had about his films that I don't think I ever sort of deeply dove into until I read your book. So I'm looking forward to riffing on PTA with you. But before we jump into more specifics about the book, I was just curious a little bit about your relationship with film, because I know you've been writing about film for many, many years. What got your foot in the door as a critic to start thinking this was a possibility to write about film for a living?
Well, I like to tell the and it's not a joke, it's a true story, that when Showgirls came out in 1995, I was the only 14-year-old who snuck into it, not because it was rated NC-17, but because the Globe and Mail gave it 0 stars, I mean, I think that from a young age, I would guess sometime around 9 or 10, the fact that my mom had a big VHS collection in our house and that she had some books by Pauline Kael really were things that I was kind of drawn towards. I mean, both my parents are journalists. I grew up in a household where the radio was always on CBC and the TV was always on 60 Minutes. And then there was a lot of media around, a lot of books. Certainly we were a reading family, a lot of movies. My mom is where I get a lot of my taste from. And while she's not a critic, she's a very analytical person. So one way that she would allow me to watch sort of, inappropriate material, or we could negotiate it, was if we discussed it, right? So, when I was 10 or 11 or 12, I wanted to watch things like, I don't know, Silence of the Lambs or Blue Velvet, or even things that weren't even that extreme, but that were adult. Mm-hmm. My parents sort of had the policy of, well, if you watch it, talk to us about it. I guess it's sort of the equivalent of, if you're going to do drugs, do them at home. If you're going to rent R-rated movies, talk to us about them. And I think that reading Kael and, other very mainstream critics at first, reading Kael, reading Roger Ebert, reading local critics, something about, I guess, the form and the expressiveness, the subjectivity of film writing really appealed to me. And when I think back on, every independent project I volunteered to do at school, like anytime you could do your own thing, I would sort of say to the teacher, like, let me write 10 reviews of movies that I saw in the theater this summer. Or let me, pick a movie I've never seen and do like a report on it. And it just flowed so naturally that in high school, I reviewed films for the paper until I became the editor of the paper, then assigned other people film reviews, which I edited, to make sure that they were right. And reviewed stuff for the university paper until I got contacted by the now defunct, but very vital at the time and long-running alternative weekly, iWeekly in Toronto.
Oh, yes. I remember iWeekly, yeah.
Which was the other alternative weekly in rivalry with Now. And it was I don't want to say it was an entirely different moment, because this is around 2000. So the impact of the internet on film writing had started, and I was not a child, right? But when I was 20, it really was as simple as the editor at iWeekly, a woman named Catherine Tunnicliffe, being like, I like your clips. Do you want to try out and review a movie or two? And in not just in retrospect, I mean, at the time, it wasn't like the earth was moving. You're like, here's $50 to review a movie for 200 words. But you know what? You have the accreditation, the access to the movie.
Right.
If you do a good job, you get more assignments. It means you're accredited for film festivals like TIFF. And it means that in the sense that there used to be a thriving print film culture and readership in Toronto, suddenly you're 2021 and on your U of T email account, where I'm an undergrad student, you have people emailing you being like, you fucking idiot. Why did you say that about this movie?
Oh,
Or
interesting.
people reaching out from magazines saying, do you want to write for us? And by the time I was in my early 20s, pretty much after I graduated from U of T, it was a supplemented income and there was, part-time work on the side, but I was kind of trying to be a professional writer. And both of my parents, being journalists, had really mixed advice, but they were both like, we want you to do this and support you in it, but it's hard. And I did it for long enough in a modest way that I went from paying rent to paying rent with, a partner on a slightly bigger place, to realizing that I kind of was traveling for free and seeing movies for free. And then the freelance checks are not just for, 50 or $100, they're for a couple $100. Maybe you actually are writing for a place that pays $1 a word and you make $1,000 to write something and you're off to the races.
Right.
I mean, now there's these very long-standing relationships with magazines like CinemaScope and publications like Reverse Shot that feel in retrospect like the spine of what I've done, and relationships with U of T where I did undergrad and graduate studies, and then they welcomed me back to try and teach. And in some ways it's harder to teach at your alma mater because these departments don't want to just keep kids around, but there were a couple of courses that opened up that were right in my wheelhouse, and so I took them. And the more mature phase since about 2013 or 2014 has been supplemented by a lot of teaching, a lot of book writing, a lot of lecturing that's kind of not just my university gigs, but like adult education and online education where you design your own curriculum, and there's paid places that really have huge numbers. I mean, lecturing to 200-300 people and paid
Wow.
paid well. And the books are a big part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's these other bylines that I'm incredibly lucky to have. In the last year, I've started writing semi-regularly for a place like the New Yorker. And so drawing absolutely no equivalency here, zero equivalency, to think about being 10 or 11 reading Pauline Kael's archives and then doing a piece for the New Yorker online, where she wrote 40 years later.
Right.
Quite edifying,
Wow.
It is, and it's a profession that it's very hard to make work as a full-time job.
Right.
Especially
Right.
now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. So basically, little by little, just gradually, it added up to bigger things, which is that's really, really great to hear. And one thing that I heard you in another interview, you said that part of the reason why you wanted to write about Paul Thomas Anderson was just to understand why you loved his film so much. And so I was curious, did you find the answer?
Well, or to understand where, what to understand what happened to my initial ambivalence, I guess. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think that to some extent, the things you discover in adolescence and the opinions you form, they do stick with you. And a lot of my favorite movies, even if I wasn't sophisticated enough at 15 to totally appreciate them, they are still things I love now and that are genuinely sophisticated. I've just grown into them,
Right.
I mean, when I was 15, that's when I was going to my video store and trying to rent Godard or Tarkovsky, or that's where I was trying to rent, like The Manchurian Candidate or something. And I don't think I faked liking those movies. I think that I liked them honestly at the time. And then you grow into the other reasons to like them. I think Anderson is an interesting case of a filmmaker who was emerging in real time for me as a teenager. He should have been someone I wanted to plant my flag in at that point, because his movies weren't directed at teenagers necessarily, but his movies were the contemporary of American movie making.
Right.
And in an odd way, I didn't reject them for maybe the obvious reason. I wasn't sort of, a jock who was like, this is boring, this is 3 hours long, get to the story. It was that as someone discovering cinema, I think I was trying to be very snobby against them. There were things that I would see in Boogie Nights or Magnolia, and I would be the kid at that time who's also watching all of Altman and feeling like older critics at the time already felt that this was somehow imitative.
Right.
I hadn't lived through Altman. I was discovering Anderson and Altman at the same time.
Of course. Yeah.
But,
right.
but also in truth, there were things about Boogie Nights and Magnolia which should have been hot ticket, red letter, my name all over it stuff in 1997 and 99 as an 18-year-old, as a 20-year-old. There were things about the films that bothered me. And so by the time I started edging into this more professional posture in the 2000s, professional, whatever, but you have a name, you have a byline. Right. You are seen as an authority. You're sent to review a horror movie. You need to know about horror. You're sent to review a movie by Claire Denis. You can't spend your review saying, who is Claire Denis, right? So you're educating yourself in real time. Your taste is developing in real time. And I think up to and even including at first the release of Punch Drunk Love, I felt pretty qualified in being a dissenter on PTA and in some ways very comfortable with the idea that he was a bit of a flash in the pan, that he was pulling the wool over a lot of people's eyes through technique, and that the films were insubstantial, whatever. And like a lot of people, when There Will Be Blood came out, I was bowled over to maybe an embarrassing degree because, it's a major movie and I like it, and I like it unreservedly. But I think that for me, as someone who'd resisted him, the polarity switched so fast. I thought the film was extraordinary. I clung to the feeling that it was extraordinary even after reading some really good negative criticism about it at the time. But it wasn't until the movie after Anderson had made his great American movie and been applauded for it. I mean, he never had made a movie before, There Will Be Blood, that had that kind of consensus. It's pretty unique consensus, right?
Definitely.
But when I saw The Master in 2012, no longer 20, but 31, not growing into my critical faculties, but feeling, however arrogantly, like they're pretty formed, feeling like if I wanted to, I could write a book, or if I wanted to, I could write a TV show, which I did for Vice about movies and all that. I saw The Master, and the voice in my head while watching it in real time said, this is an incredible film. And it's an incredible, bottomless, deconstructible film. And I didn't have a bad time watching it, but I had a tough time watching it in the first time in real time, because all my brain was doing was composing all the stuff that I felt like I was picking up on. I don't mean that it spoke to me in a way that's personal.
Right.
I do not want to join or start a cult. Nor am I a demented erotomaniac, sailor. But there was the film language, the storytelling language, all the stuff that was being left out, and all the weird connective tissue that's barely holding it together. It's just my thing. Not out of nowhere, because I remember at the time people were making comparisons that really clarified for me why I liked it so much. People said it's like an American Apichatpong movie, or an American Claire Denis movie, or he's thrown away Altman and he's chasing Kubrick. And in my head, I'm going, yes, this is true. And I think that after that, with Inherent Vice, certainly Phantom Thread, I had a real interest in writing about the films. Phantom Thread was around the time when the idea of doing a book on him was on the table. At which point, I went back to all the films and did not suddenly love them, but found such a wealth of reception that other people to try and synthesize against my own thoughts. Because to be clear, not liking Boogie Nights or Magnolia as a teenager doesn't mean you sort of decide for all time these are irrelevant movies. I know some people who dislike him to the point that they find him, irrelevant, or they find him a sort of annoying major filmmaker, but it's like they wish they didn't have to consider him. We all have people like that.
Right.
Even when I was ambivalent about him, I would have never said he was untalented.
Right.
And in going back to the films for the book, I tried not to betray myself either way. I tried not to do the thing where it's like, because I am writing a book about these movies, they're good. Love them. But I also tried to not be too stubborn, you know. And the movies, once you start putting them in that auteurist conversation with each other, once you choose that form of analysis, they're very eloquent the way they speak to each other. I can still I can still play favorites in conversation. Like, you know, I can rank them, or we can say I like this one the most or this one the least. And that's why the title of the book, when we picked it with my editors at Little White Lies and Abrams, you know, I had a slightly mixed feeling about it, because I thought they're not all masterworks, and I don't write about them as such. But besides the pun on the title of the master, you know, the double entendre is also the idea of working. And so tried to get across in the book, both in my own analysis, but in the interviews with his collaborators, something of how Anderson works. And I think that there's a way sometimes that his mastery is not always a plus, or his mastery is not always a benefit. So when you take the book's title, Masterworks, there's a funny tension in it. And I know you've read it, where I certainly don't describe all the films as that, but I do try and talk about how they work. And I think the highest compliment that I can pay him, and it's a high compliment, I think it's because I think he's a really significant American filmmaker. I would say that when he works, the way in which he works, for all his pastiche and copying, is pretty singular, and it really does defy, to some extent, easy understanding of how he does this. Right? There are things in his movies where the engineering of them, and I don't mean the degree of difficulty of the shot or the length of the take. I mean, that too. There's moments that he engineers in certain of his films that are they're sublime. And
absolutely.
And I love trying to figure out, or parse out, or, you know, proclaim, or whatever, you know, how he does that, because I think he's pretty. I think when he's on, he's remarkable.
No, that's what I like so much about the book, because when I was going into it, I was okay. Is this going to be a book purely praising this man and his work, again because of the title, or you know, where is this going to be? How are you going to explore his films? And that's what I really appreciated about it, because as I said earlier, a lot of the flaws you pointed out, I mean, some of these films I haven't seen in maybe 15 years. Like, I don't think I've seen Magnolia or Boogie Nights since I was 20. Like, it had been a while. And then revisiting them, like I said, I was like, okay, I could see why some of these scenes in Boogie Nights, like the "I'm a fucking idiot" scene with Philip Seymour Hoffman, I could see why that is so unforgettable, and I get lost in it. And like, I'm just watching a moment that is so real. And then again, slipping into why I didn't like other things. But that's what I appreciated so much about the book, because I think you really did him justice in terms of pointing out the flaws, but then pointing out all of the things about him that I agree that make him truly remarkable and talented. You know, Sorry, well, you go ahead.
What I was going to say is that auteurism is very dangerously proximate to cheerleading, right? And it's not critics that brand filmmakers masters. I mean, some filmmakers have very self-branding styles, and they use the possessive in their titles. You know, John Carpenter's this, the fourth film by Quentin Tarantino. You know, this was not always the case.
Right.
Anderson has constructed himself, to some extent in interviews, but certainly in his movies, as a masterful figure. And he's interested in masterful figures. He's interested in virtuosos, right? You know, Heart 8 is not just about an old gambler. It's about an old gambler who is like going to teach you how to do stuff. And Boogie Nights is about, you know, the biggest cock in the world. And Magnolia is a bunch of small characters, but, you know, with like this global cosmic significance. You know, their Windy Blood is all about the building of monuments and the image of Daniel Plainview. And then he has movies about cult leaders. He has movies about master designers, you know.
Yeah.
It's a theme that's a bit of self-projection. And as he's gotten older, I think he's shaded and complicated that theme interestingly. But I think that with Anderson, he leads you, or he has led people in the past, to perceive him as a master because of what the movies are about, how they're about them, and how smartly he has exploited that idea of the great director, because he quotes all these other great directors in visual work.
Right.
When you're quoting Altman, when you're quoting Scorsese, you're leaving breadcrumbs for sort of people to be like, well, you're the protege, they're the master, but you're next in line. You know, it's a slightly different kind of postmodernism than Tarantino, who around the same time wasn't really evoking great masters. He was kind of just evoking his whole junkie collection.
Right, of course. Yeah.
You know, whereas Anderson is like going straight for Scorsese. And so the reason I mention this in terms of the book is that there is, and I like talking about this, which is why I hope it's okay that I'm mentioning it, is that there is a bit of an implicit cheerleading in making such a big, visually complex book about a filmmaker. You're not going to spend $50 on a big, beautifully designed book that argues the guy sucks, right? I mean, that would just be, I mean, that would be completely antithetical and, you know, mistruth in advertising. At the same time, you know, the books are not made in collaboration with the filmmaker. So I'm kind of interested in my Fincher book even more so, because it's even more mixed on the films, because I'm more mixed on the films while thinking also David Fincher's a really great filmmaker sometimes. You know, I'm interested in that idea that you can use the format and in some ways quite cynically use the prominence or the consensus around a director, not to trick anybody or fool anybody, and you know kick the shit out of a filmmaker, you know, while people think they're going to read something nice. But it is interesting to try and leverage this heroic strain of auteurism that I think Anderson believes in, and I think very self-consciously tried to build around himself in the 90s. I mean, he's trying to be that guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's interesting to leverage that against not a takedown or not a hit on it, but kind of a consideration of what all that means and where it comes from.
Right.
And this idea of received or sequential auteurism, where the original filmmakers that the French critics singled out were actually people working quite quietly and modestly within the system.
That's true.
They were not the cinematic, let's say, singer-songwriters who write the script and plan the shots and throw their name on it and talk about how it's their coming of age.
Right.
I mean, in a way, the concept of auteurism has mutated. I don't think it's been distorted or disfigured, and I don't think it doesn't mean anything anymore. But Anderson's auteurism means differently. This is not seeking out signature or personality in the margins of studio work. This is increasingly looking at movies that are built in his image, and you know it from the second
definitely
his name is on the screen.
Yeah.
So it's a different critical project.
Yeah. No, I again, it works so beautifully, I felt. And as I said before we recorded, I wanted to touch a little on each film. I mean, ideally we could talk for 2 weeks straight about each one, because they're you really wrote these beautiful, in-depth critical analysis of the films. I mean, there's so much I'd like to say and ask, but just pointing at some of the flaws you pointed out. One thing about Hard Eight, I was curious your opinion on this, was we get to this point where Samuel Jackson's character Jimmy decides to blackmail Sidney, and says to him, puts a gun to him and says, "Give me 10 grand or else I'm gonna tell John," who John C. Reilly plays, John C. Reilly's character, that you killed his father. For anyone who hasn't seen the film, Sidney kills John C. Reilly's father, and John C. Reilly's character has become like a son to him, and he's trying to work out his guilt about what he did by helping John. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that. But one thing that struck me as a little strange about Jimmy's motive is that he knows that Sidney was this ruthless gangster, has this past, and he blackmails him and then doesn't kill him and just feels that he's going to get away with this. And I thought, why would is Jimmy that naive to think that he could get away with doing this and this guy wasn't going to come after him? Do you see that as a flaw, or do you think it is acceptable that this guy was just that naive?
Well, I mean, it depends on if you evaluate movies based on, plausibility of behavior. I mean, Hard Eight is a movie that's structured very much as a neo-noir.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It has characters who inhabit certain archetypes, and then I think what's meant to differentiate it is, the elegance of the presentation, but also the soulfulness of the lead performance.
So good.
And I think you could argue in some ways that for the movie to work, the only character who has to work is Sidney.
Yeah.
I'm of the mind that the Jimmy character doesn't really work, and it's not for a lack of a good actor, because Sam Jackson's a great actor.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And in some ways, he would have been the most the hottest actor in the cast, because that had the good fortune to come out about a year and a half after Pulp Fiction had been a thing.
Right.
But I think Jimmy is playing a bit of a plot device, and in order for the mechanism of the movie to click into place, this particular device has to malfunction a bit.
Right, of course, yeah.
He has to underestimate Sidney. Now, this idea of Sidney being underestimated is kind of interesting, that he's an old guy.
Right.
And that Jimmy, through a belief in his own smartness and potency, you see him acting at the craps table like you had seen Philip Seymour Hoffman's guy acting like that at the craps table earlier.
Too. It's a great scene.
Great scene. But these two younger guys kind of drunk on their own potency, and Sidney's kind of just in the shadows biding his time. But what I would say about Hard Eight is that while the filmmaking throughout is pretty impressive, and I like the film. I like it a lot.
So do I. Yeah, I always liked it, and when I watched it again, I was like, this is actually a lot better than I remembered. I think it's a fine debut.
It's a fine debut. What I was going to say is, while the filmmaking holds up, the plotting doesn't.
Right.
And I
it doesn't totally work, but
doesn't totally work, and it's not saved. Doesn't need to be saved. But what's good in the end is that you have two scenes that have a lot of the potency that Anderson is good at. In the phone call is terrific. Anderson's a great director of phone calls. He's a great phone call filmmaker.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the final shot, which gets
that's beautiful.
Mirrored and echoed later in There Will Be Blood, where the tiny fleck on the collar on the
becomes a pool of blood later.
Pool of blood on the floor. But Hard Eight's a pretty good debut, and Anderson at the time told anyone who would listen that it was a great debut, and that it would have been even better if his distributor hadn't messed with him. And had he not done that, I think the movie would have been less well received. But he created a narrative about himself. And the narrative was this thwarted visionary, versus the bean counters, even though he was given more freedom and resource, and in some ways more support than any debut filmmaker should get. But of course, everyone's trying at that time to make a new Tarantino.
Right.
And until he becomes what he becomes later, I think that's why people kept investing in him. He can BRQT until it becomes his own acronym later on.
Right. Well, I think I totally agree that there are problems with the plot, but for me, I can forgive those elements because the characters, particularly Sidney, just the whole element of this man who has this, very brutal past. He also has a reference to not knowing where his children are. So now Gwyneth Paltrow and John C. Reilly are kind of assuming those parts. They're like his kids. It's really interesting just on a character level. You know, I think I found it really compelling. But yeah, that thing with Jimmy, I just thought, is would that guy really not? I guess he just thought, well, he's an old man now, and what's he gonna do?
Well,
Fair enough, I could accept it, but it's a little.
There's that. There's the fact that the Clementine character is pretty basic. You know,
yeah.
You have Gwyneth Paltrow there, really in sort of just a decorative role, and even even I think the way her scenes are acted and directed are not exactly electric. You know. But that's in some ways because he's writing to or he's directing to genre, and I think pretty quickly after that he finds himself in milieus and situations where some of the background characters or the female characters, even the lead ones, can have a little more personality and autonomy. I mean, you could argue that some of the women in Boogie Nights are cliches, or you could argue that they inhabit cliches because that's the job, and then you have interesting performances still that show the characters trapped in roles, as opposed to Paltrow in Boogie Nights, who really is just kind of a device.
Right. No, I totally agree. On the just now that we've touched on Boogie Nights, we have, shop, so much of it reminds you of Goodfellas or other Scorsese films. So many characters, different, not necessarily different storylines, but distinct characters with different sets of problems. The whole, these beautiful, I mean, I love the themes of the 70s going into the 80s. With all of that said, I mean, where do you think the heart of the film lies? I mean, what do you think? What do you think emotionally the essence of the film is?
Well, I think I write in the book that I think Anderson is pulled in half in this film to the extent that it's a personal film, right? He is absolutely that big dicked wannabe, right? Who's this potent ingenue who's going to show everybody what he can do. And I think filmmaking in some ways has a Dirk Diggler quality to it, and that it goes kind of kamikaze and out of control, and in some ways very callow movie. But I think he also sees himself prematurely, to use another phallic reference. I think he sees himself prematurely as Jack Horner. I think he sees himself as a classicist, and as someone who's using filmmaking to cultivate a family and to cultivate these quite tender relationships. Now, they're also transactional because, Jack seems to fuck his actors too.
Right.
But it's interesting that he's never really portrayed as an exploiter. And it's not until the 80s come around with the return of Philip Baker Hall as the immortally monikered Floyd Gondoli.
Right on New Year's.
On New Year's Eve, where the idea that maybe porn is going to be not just liberty and not just excitement or adventure, but actually where it's going to become this kind of transactional, packaged, soul deadening business. I think Anderson is portraying himself as someone who was born too late. Either he's trying to turn the 90s into the 70s by recreating the 70s, or he's lamenting that he has to make movies now. And I've always thought that the use of not just video but audio tape in the movie is interesting, because the insane coked out drug dealer played by Alfred Molina is totally associated with his tapes. And the idea that he doesn't have the patience to listen to entire albums. You see at the New Year's party how much pleasure they take in needle drops. Jack, the coherence of his film as a story. Don Cheadle talks about listening to albums, with perfect sound. But then Molina's just basically happy to put whatever crap on.
Right.
Crap.
that had never dawned on me until you wrote that in the book. I was like, that's so true. It never really dawned on me that that's what that was about with the tape.
But so I think that's where Anderson's like self-image is at, as to where his heart is. I mean, I think his heart is a big heart, but big-hearted filmmaking can also be a bit disingenuous. And I've never fully been able to reconcile how kind of weirdly prudish Boogie Nights is, like this need to punish everybody, to expel them from Eden so brutally.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But then also to bring them back and put them back together again in a way that's sentimental. And I've heard people argue that it's so sentimental that it has to be satire, or it's so sentimental that it has to be between the lines tragic, that he can't possibly believe in that kind of happy ending. But I don't know if he had I don't know if he quite had the texture in the movie making for me to believe multiple things at once. It's a movie that lurches pretty wildly between fun and not fun.
Right.
And the fun is a little shallow, and the not fun is weirdly prurient and moralistic.
Right.
Now, technique and vibes are often amazing.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
And there's a reason that critics especially, but also, kind of cooler, tastemakery, film people, they did go for it.
Oh yeah.
25 years later, it's not like it looks bad, but I there's things about it I distrust.
Right. Well, I mean, to me, I actually agree. I agree with everything you're saying. But to me, it never sort of bothered me, the sort of happy ending, because I just felt, really, it's these, I always, and I know you touched on this in the book too, but I always felt it was just people with this need for family and this like in this weird, fucked up way. But everything from I mean, there's this great shot where Wahlberg, when he leaves, and that scene is actually quite disturbing. That scene with his mother, where he storms out and she slams the door, and immediately after that, Jack opens his door. I had never picked up on that, but this need for these people who love each other so much. And one thing I'm curious what you felt about this, but people who really love each other, they can have these vicious fights and kind of easily come back together because of that foundation. I mean, he basically comes back and says, I'm sorry, and he's genuine about it. And I mean, I can accept that. I believe in that. I mean, I think he did, for all the flaw. I mean, yeah, I think that there are issues. I mean, you even mentioned the 80s, it had a certain sanitized experience to it. He sort of ignores the AIDS epidemic at the time, so, but for all its flaws, I think the heart of it is quite powerful in my view.
I mean, yeah, I think it's a fair read. I think that I think that in Heart 8 and in Boogie Nights, and certainly in Magnolia, the read that critics had on them, and the early book on Anderson, was that he's a filmmaker of surrogate family. People who have, like Macy says in Magnolia, I have all this love to give, I kind of just don't always know where to put it.
Right.
And the fact that love is both, the thing to aspire towards and the thing you want, but it can also be just this source of unbelievable pain and lack of fulfillment. And so that he was sort of making, in a weird way, these kind of male weepies,
Right.
He was making very male-coded melodramas where I don't think that there's anything, even when his ensembles are filled with women like they are in Magnolia, he fundamentally a male filmmaker, but a male filmmaker of emotion, and a male filmmaker who distrusts typical machismo. Because the more macho Dirk gets in Boogie Nights, he's kind of a moron.
Right. He doesn't glamorize it. He's not like Tarantino, who glamorizes it.
No, and the Tom Cruise character in Magnolia is a big joke. So while you couldn't look at Boogie Nights and Magnolia and say, we've discovered a great, male feminist director, or even a particularly queer director, because again, homosexuality and Boogie Nights tragic and backgrounded, and in Magnolia it's, you know, backgrounded and implied.
Right.
But what you did have, a little antithetical to Tarantino, and certainly different than the really cold millennial directors like Spike Jonze and David Fincher, was you did have an emotionalist.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that love was kind of what's on the menu. Now that I'm not saying that has disappeared on the other side of the millennium, but if There Will Be Blood is a movie about love, it's figured much differently. And if The Master is about love, it's figured much differently. It's funny because Punch Drunk Love and Phantom Thread are the two romantic comedies that maybe are the most about love as a form of equilibrium, but elsewhere, love really is pain in those films.
Yes.
And I think that Magnolia is a movie where it's so amplified and doubled and tripled and quadrupled. I mean, there's 12 different fugues of pain going on at the same time. And that can take a lot out of you.
Right.
As a viewer. Some people, it can really electrify them, or it can be like snorting cocaine, which Anderson has said he wrote the movie while on. It's kind of a coke movie. But
it does feel that way. You get so invested in one story, and then boom, he goes to another and back and forth, and I'm like, holy shit, I'm playing ping pong here.
Yeah, but for people who I think don't like feeling worked over unless it's really for a reason, I can see why Magnolia drove some people crazy, and still for me, it's one that I have deeply mixed feelings.
Right. Well, again, I watched it recently, and I'm pretty sure it's been a number of years since I've seen it. And I really enjoyed it. And just one thing that you said, and I'm curious your opinion, was you pointed out that Paul Thomas Anderson not too long ago felt, okay, maybe I should have made it shorter, cut out 20 minutes. And you mentioned in the book that the epilogue really wasn't sort of used very well with the rest of the film. Would you have cut that out if you could make a choice or advise PTA?
I would.
Would you take that epo?
It's not. No, that's not for me to say. I mean, you're confronted with the finished film and you decide what works and what doesn't. I've always thought that movie, and I said it in the book too, that the Stanley Spector, not a movie star character, the little kid on What Do Kids Know, the child actor and his dad, who's not played by anybody famous, they get to have the pivotal exchange in the film, which is the morning after.
Yeah.
He kind of comes into his dad's bedroom and sort of says, you should be nicer to me. And he's saying it on behalf of a bunch of children in the film, former children, who didn't say that to their parents or who never got that message across.
Right.
He seems to be saying it as a sort of universal truth. I mean, the William Macy character says it's not wrong to compare children to angels, and the Stanley Spector character is given a kind of angelic visual look throughout the film. He even has kind of framed by wings at one point. And I've always wondered if a 3-hour film of so much chaos and pretension, right, to boil down to you need to be nicer to me, if that's the biggest example of using a fly, an elephant to swat a fly, or if it's taking a simple truth and inflating it to the size that it should be, which is that actually this is something that is a small thing, but it saves a life. It saves children from pain later. It saves parents from pain in the present tense. I've never been able to say which it definitely is. I think if the movie was more evenly good or evenly bad, I'd be able to say whether that works or not as a thesis. Mm-hmm. What I'll say is that's the film where the kamikaze quality or the weirdly, self-destructive quality that he has is on display. And the whole movie kind of alternates between him putting his back to the wall and somehow getting out of it, and putting his back to the wall and just like not getting out of it. But that scene where they all sing Amy Mann,
right,
I think is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And it's extraordinary because it's so close to being so banal.
Right.
Cheesy.
It's like a music video. I think it became a music video, a separate video, I believe.
Like a music video, like I mean, I know other critics, they use sports metaphors, you know, it's like it's a Hail Mary, it's a buzzer beater, it's how am I going to get out of this 3 minutes of film alive, you know?
Right.
And I don't think he gets out of every big scene in the movie alive, but I think that there's a couple pretty big ones that he
Mhm.
does make his way out of. And you know, for a film that I have mixed feelings about, the things in it that are good, like James Robards, one of his last performances, maybe his last
Oh,
performance, is
brilliant.
his deathbed monologue, or
Yeah.
Philip Seymour Hoffman again acting on the phone.
Yeah. Oh,
You know, those are things that I think are very strong.
yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Sorry, I just realized I phrased my question in the wrong way. What I meant was not the ending, but the opening
The prologue,
was.
yeah. Well,
I'm
even
sorry. I think I said epilogue by accident.
no, no, man, don't worry about
Yeah.
it. And I
Yeah.
still wouldn't presume to cut it. But what I would say about
Yeah.
the opening is,
If
not a-
PTA asked your advice, was maybe the way I should ask.
yeah, really, no. I mean, I've interviewed him since the book, but no, he's not going to ask my advice. But he's very
Yeah.
nice. We had a very nice talk about the
Oh,
book.
great.
One of those things you end up I'll keep the content to myself, but I'm also, I would say, happy that we had the conversation. It wasn't a conversation that ended with me sort of being like, okay, sorry, you know, it was good. It was positive. Very,
I was
very,
going to ask if you had met him, so I'm happy to hear that you did. I would, because I know that you didn't when you were writing it, so I was
you
curious if you did
know,
met him since.
you know, I'll say this. I mean, I told him over the course of when we talked that around the same time I was interviewing him, because I interviewed him for the release of Licorice Pizza. This was only about a year ago,
Right.
not even a year ago. But I was also teaching a class on him at U of T, him and the Coens, this authorship course. And I was surprised by how taken aback he was by that. The taken aback had nothing to do with the fact that I was teaching, and he's like, that's cool. But he still felt, I think, not disingenuously or performatively, pretty sincerely, he was kind of intimidated by the idea that students were like watching his films and writing about them.
Oh, that's interesting.
He was just
I would have thought he'd be all for that, being like a
he
film
wasn't
student in a way.
he wasn't against it. He was
Right.
quite he was like, really? Like, what would you
It's
guys talk
interesting.
about? What do you guys talk about, or what do they think? And I sort of said, here's some things that people have thought is the. I mean, I think he found the whole thing. I don't want to use the wrong word. I'm not saying he found it amusing. He wasn't like, oh, that's nice. He was quite. He was into it, and he was like, he sounded oddly, like curious, almost like he was like, well, what do they think? You know. And because I told him that it's teaching them, not promoting them. So, you know, maybe since he'd read the book and seen that the book was somewhat ambivalent, he's like, oh shit, are you teaching them the negative stuff? You know,
Right.
you'd also hope to think that someone like him has the, you know, thick skin. And I think he does. And I think Magnolia was a good example of a filmmaker who, to some extent, was humbled. I mean,
Mm.
the movie wasn't a disaster by any means.
No, God, no.
He's never had a disaster, but it also didn't do what they thought it would. And it's telling to me that he has said in his older years that, like, okay, I was a little full of it. I was
Right.
a little full of something. You
Right.
know,
Right.
I think
Well,
it's telling.
to me, it's interesting because you're pointing out that that people have always been split on him. There's been various opinions. People have found the ending to be too simplistic for their all these people's massive problems. But I don't really feel that it's just saying, oh, here's your happy ending. And I think, to me, it's just an optimistic ending. I don't think he's saying that these people's problems are settled. I think he's
Oh,
just saying there is hope in everything with the frogs and the rain washing away all of the decay, and there's hope for tomorrow. I never felt that he was saying this is everything's gonna be okay. You know, I mean, my favorite filmmaker is John Cassavetes, and his films are so difficult, emotionally challenging and pragmatic, but his films are always very hopeful. And I've never heard anyone say, I mean, not everyone loves him, but I've never heard anyone say, "Oh, his movies are too simplistic." I mean, they say the opposite. He has very hopeful, idealistic endings, and I felt that this was similar with Magnolia.
But there's such an interesting comparison there, because Cassavetes never, I mean, he developed a pretty recognizable style, and there's incredible craft in a way in his films.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Cassavetes privileged the actor above all else, so that his films were not conventionally or overly scenic or pictorial, right? I mean, it's interesting. Punch Drunk Love, made differently, could be a Cassavetes movie.
Right? It could, yeah.
Made differently, the same
in a much rougher way, yes.
Could be a Cassavetes movie, but it's made like a Jacques Demy movie, or it's made like a Vincent Minnelli movie, or it's made like an Altman movie, like Popeye. And so, their form and style, they don't overpower substance or subject matter, but they kind of molecularly reconfigure it. I mean, Punch Drunk Love is about male rage. Punch Drunk Love is about male insecurity and frustration, and about true love, that has a Cassavetesian quality.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's true.
It has some of Minnie and Moskovitz. It has some of Opening Night. It has something of Love Streams, but the visual style was different. And everything that was bombastic and overbearing in Magnolia is slightly retooled in Punch Drunk Love, where it is not an austere or subtle movie.
Right.
There is something about the style in Punch Drunk Love where you're like, oh, I get it. It's about pleasure. Right? Maybe not everyone's idea of pleasure. Maybe not everybody's ideal aesthetic experience is color bars and dissonant, John Bryan music and Adam Sandler's blue suit.
But you know what he's going for. You can feel it.
And the constant tension in Punch Drunk Love is also still a pleasurable and aestheticized tension. I think Magnolia is not a hugely pleasurable movie. It's cathartic, maybe, but it's not pleasurable. Punch Drunk Love is just like delightful. And I guess if your terms of delight are 180 degrees away from its terms, well, that's just unfortunate for both of you, for you and for the movie. But if you halfway allow yourself to be on Punch Drunk Love's wavelength, it's a romp.
Right. Oh no, it certainly is. I know you had mentioned you initially didn't care for it. What changed for you? How did you come to like it?
I think that was a case of my peak sense of professional obligation at age 21 or 22 to be down on new American movies.
I see.
Sort of dovetailed with a movie that still, even now, there's things about it that I find precious, and that I find, it is one of those movies where like male volatility and volubility is romanticized. And I think one of the worst things that happened to North American culture in the last 20 years is this kind of like, male rage, male aggression is something ultimately to kind of be cradled and sentimentalized. I mean, there's things that do it 1,000 times worse than Punch Drunk Love, but it is on that page, right?
Oh yeah.
But over time, in returning to it, there's something in the exuberance and the energy. There's something in the depth of emotion that you get out of Sandler, and just the sheer whirl of it is pretty beguiling, And I love how concise it is. I mean, I joked in the book, it's almost like someone just took a plot off Magnolia and pruned it into its own little movie. It is one that I like now, and I think is really very charming and quite beautiful.
Well, when I again, this was another one I hadn't seen in a number of years, and when I first saw it, I think I saw it not long after it came out, and I really, I really liked it again. And for some of the scenes, like, I know that this is a scene you really liked, was another phone scene with Phil Hoffman saying shut
Yeah.
up over. I mean, when I first saw that, I couldn't stop laughing. I mean, to me, it's one of the funniest scenes I've ever seen in a movie. And in a way, this taking the Adam Sandler, Happy Gilmore, and Billy Madison kind of story and turning it into something a little more complicated. It's appealing. I don't know. It just, when I watched it again, it just. I mean, I think if you're looking at it from that view, it's like, okay, I could see what he's doing. That's interesting. But if I don't know those movies, I just think he had these severe problems. That why would, I mean, I couldn't understand why this woman would be loving him and accepting him, and she's like this angelic angel. It just didn't sit well with me. I want to like
No,
it,
it's a fantasy.
yeah.
It's a very convenient fantasy. And it's a fantasy where, depending on how you read the film, it's almost like his need for a kind of a receptacle. And I don't mean a receptacle in a sexual way. I mean just his need for someone to just accept what he throws out into the world. It's like, did his need create her? I mean, I think it's interesting that
she could almost not even be a real person.
Almost not a real person.
Yeah, right. It's fantasy.
And that's then followed by a film, There Will Be Blood, where there are no women, period.
Right.
And then a film after that that's actually about someone who wants a fantasy too, but he can't seem to create one. His fantasy woman won't show up. She just kind of keeps fooling him and not really coming. So that obsessive.
That's a good point.
That the obsessive yearning, that trope, that feeling in his movies of yearning, that becomes a connective tissue between Punch Drunk Love and There Will Be Blood. And so does that theme, which you had a little bit in some of the older movies. You have it in Boogie Nights and Magnolia, but just that theme of entrepreneurship, that idea of trying to build yourself up and make a product and hit a constituency. That's what the guy in Punch Drunk Love wants. He wants to sell fiberglass toilet plungers. And that's what Daniel Plainview wants in There Will Be Blood. It becomes their way, these eccentric characters, their way of trying to access a community by selling to them. Right.
That's it. The ways in which the films connect are really appealing. For me, this sense of, like, fathers and sons. I mean, or even, you could say like in the Master's case, that they could be like a need for a brother, perhaps, or like a best friend. I find that really strong in a lot of his films. One thing that you felt, because. Well, I'm curious why you felt this way, because I always felt that he really came into his own with There Will Be Blood, because at this point I don't feel that I'm seeing a take on, I shouldn't say a take, but there's less of a connection to other filmmakers or other times. Yeah. I mean, you could say that about any film, that it reminds you of. I mean, everything reminds you of something, but his films. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. Like, so much of it reminds me of other films. Whereas There Will Be Blood, I just feel like this is a total original film. Not that it. I mean, obviously there are influences, but it feels very much like it's a brand new director. Like, it's hard to believe it's the same guy. So I'm curious, because I know that you felt that Punch Drunk Love was really that movie. I was curious why that is.
Well, or Punch Drunk Love is the transition. It kind of is that movie, or it kind of is saying that movie is right here. It's like right on the doorstep of what we're doing. I mean, I think that with There Will Be Blood, the factor that just wowed everybody was how this filmmaker suddenly managed to pull off a kind of a severity, like a fearsome kind of a severity. And some of that is because it's the past and a period piece, and because it's about this obsessive, wildcat oil guy. But the score and the sound design and the color palette and the shooting and the physicality of the Day-Lewis performance, it's like pretty severe. And for lack of a better word, very arty. And arty is not a word that I like, and it can mean anything. But those opening 15 minutes of There Will Be Blood, which conspicuously have no dialogue,
right,
and which conspicuously cut out certain connective tissue things about who founded, he's out there by himself, and then how does he put together his team of diggers, and how does he put together this community, and how does he build it? They're so rich, they're so suggestive. What you have in There Will Be Blood is the birth of him as a historical filmmaker. Now, Boogie Nights was the audition for that, but it's a history that's within his lived experience to some
right.
In some ways,
right.
It's the great teenage orgy that he never got to have. He kind of makes it with studio money. But There Will Be Blood is a movie where America is kind of a blank canvas. And that's where you get that amazing shot of Daniel Plainview signing the check superimposed on the well site. It's like he's literally buying up this environment.
Right.
And I think that people call him a kind of psychic historian, or that his films are these period pieces that narrate 20th century America. I mean, that's how we structured the book. We structured the order that the movies are set.
Yes.
I mean, Anderson's history is obviously going to be as narrow as the settings. As long as he stays in California, he's only narrating the history of a place. But even that's pretty ambitious, right?
Oh, definitely.
And There Will Be Blood is certainly a movie that sort of says funny things about manifest destiny. It says, well, you got here, and everything's waiting for you, and you're, as long as you're smarter than some kid from the church, it is kind of all going to be yours. But there's no real promise of fulfillment anywhere in the movie.
Right.
You have a character, it's not that he has an insatiable appetite for life, it's that he's emotionally bulimic, or emotionally anorexic. I mean, he's never going to fill himself up, and he's miserable. And so it doesn't become a movie about, will Daniel Plainview's ambitions, launch his heart into the stratosphere. It's sort of like, this guy's really good, and he mostly has the upper hand, and he mostly gets what he wants. What's going to destroy him in the end?
Right.
In the end, what he's destroyed by is a version of love, of unrequited love, of unfulfilled love, of misplaced love,
right,
an inability to express love.
Yes.
He loved in return with his adopted son, who he took on with such guilt.
Right.
And so those things are what's percolating underneath the immaculately strange Western period piece surface. It's just how much love there is, but it doesn't come to a good place.
Right. Well, that's what I always found so fascinating about Daniel Plainview. You and I may have been at the same screening of it in 2007. I know you had mentioned seeing it in the movie theaters, because I remember going to see, it was a preview. It was not even out yet, and it's one of the few times I've been in a movie theater where everyone stood and applauded. I mean, most people, anyways. You may have even been there. But me and my friend, we saw it a number of times, and I've always just been. I mean, to me, it's one of the best films I've seen this century, from my own personal opinion. But just this man who, yeah, I mean, you're right. He's ambition. He's ambitious, and then it ends up. It ends up destroying him in a lot of ways, because he's just emotionally crippled. I mean, it's ambiguous because you don't really know why, or his backstory, and what the when his brother comes, who's not his brother in the end, and he kills him. I mean, it's a fascinating character, and I love what you say at the end of the book, is that he's inviting people to sort of come in and have their own views, because he's not giving you all the answers. And I love films that have the audience participate in that sense. I mean, it's ambiguous. I mean, we could talk talk about so many possibilities with this man, which I think is so enriching.
I mean, I choose to see him among other things, as you know, I choose to see him as someone who's his brilliance at what he does only incites his frustration that it can't be total. You know, it's a character who doesn't want, if he can't have it all, he doesn't want a part.
Right.
That's a character type that you can sentimentalize, or it's a character type that you can take to a very unflattering, you know, conclusion. I mean, by the end, you're like, how many more victory laps does he need to run? How many more kids does he have the chance still to raise and you know, protect? You know, if he were to get over his pride, if he were to get over himself, he's a character who, on some level, believes fulfillment is impossible, and then self-prophesies that, or he turns it into a self-fulfilling, you know, prophecy. And part of the film that I write about in the book, I try and write about it as dazzlingly as it dazzled me, is the match cut where HW's childhood falls away, trauma is glossed over, cause and effect is out the window, but time is gone. And the time that Daniel may have had himself to repent or change or learn is gone.
Right.
And the coda takes place amidst the ruins, with Daniel as a ruin as well. And I love that Anderson doesn't go back and totally fill in the ellipsis, but he does briefly, after the older HW and Daniel have their arguments in sign language. He does go back for about 20 seconds to HW and the young Mary playing with Daniel, circa before.
Yes.
And
it's one of the few times you see him smile in the film, right? It's
beautiful. And what do we see him do, even though it's in flashback and it's not significant? It's part of
right.
It. He pushes him away.
Yeah, and he goes back to whatever work he has at hand.
Yeah. And I've always found that the way that little bit was staged, it's not even like it's an inappropriate reaction to a child. HW is not upset during the flashback. They're playing.
Right. Yeah.
But it's the gesture of pushing away. That's so much of what man he's going to become. So
yeah, no, it's so good. I mean, I'm biting my tongue because I could talk about it all day.
Yeah.
But I you know, and there's we obviously he has a few more films after this, but also I agree with you. I mean, The Master to me again is a film of his. I mean, it's just brilliant. I mean, this and There'll Be Blood are two of his best in my view. But I wanted to ask something, because you said something that about the ending that I really liked, was that you said that Freddie weeps at Dodd's song demonstrates perhaps a swell of feeling at the recognition that he's wanted. What empowers him is the realization that being wanted is not in and of itself reason enough to stay, which is certainly true. But I wonder if you also felt that there's another layer there of these that Freddie is looking at Dodd and he's crying because he does love this man. Like on one level, it's like, you know, I love you like a brother, but I can't be with you anymore. It's like a breakup. It's like, I love you, you know, you want children and I don't. So we have to split up. You know,
what I love about the scene is that it's totally ambiguous, but totally definitive. And you can
that's true.
And you can actually believe after that scene, they will not see each other ever again. Right.
I believe it.
I mean, if you believe in the afterlife and that, you know, Dodd then, you know, maybe they will, or
that they'll be sworn enemies in the next life, as Dodd says.
But the movie is so much about point of view, and the way that he moves on from Dodd and immediately goes to the bar and immediately hits it off with his dream girl, because they're all his dream girls, you know. They're all little versions of old Doris Day, his girlfriend, Doris whatever, who becomes Doris Day. And he only has eyes at that point for, you know, this girl in a pub who he can actually pick up and have sex with, which he hasn't done for the whole film. I mean, the movie is like this psychogenic fugue of like wanting to get off, which he keeps being denied through all these
Right.
through all these turns of events. I mean, again,
I was glad that you wrote about that, because that was something that I'd never really I had never really noticed that, and when I watched it again, I was like, oh yeah, like just the with the song, that when they're all singing that song, and then suddenly he's seeing everyone naked. It's like, it's just,
I love that scene. I love
that's
that.
brilliant. And I never knew what the hell that was about until you had written, because it's true, because right before that, you know, Dodd's daughter flirts with, comes on to him, and he's like, well, I can't do anything, even though he wants to, clearly. And then he has this vision, which is like a cock block. It's brilliant. I never really noticed that.
You have these two scenes where these figures of desire whirl in front of him to music that is very disingenuously preaching abstinence. You have it in the department store with the girl with the cloak.
Oh
and
yeah,
God singing "I'll no more go a roving" while surrounded by these naked ladies. I think The Master is the film that has an almost just peerless like visual symbolic vocabulary, where, you know, it's not, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that it breathes and has space and spontaneity, and it's clearly got real people in it, but the design of this film, you know, the design, the way that different spaces and costumes and bits of set dressing are all integrated together is just dizzying, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
All the way,
Absolutely.
the way they're all integrated together to evoke some kind of inner meaning, or to bleed through some kind of inner meaning in almost every, you know, permutation possible, is you know, why that film kind of set my brain on fire, and where it remains. You know, I've still not had a viewing of the film that feels in any way ordinary to me. It's an extraordinary movie.
I totally agree. It's such a masterpiece. And after this, you know, Inherent Vice was a film that I really did not like at all. And it was interesting to me to see to go from There Will Be Blood to The Master, to see them in the theaters, and then to have this director make a film after that. I was like, I mean, I hate the word hate, but I almost hate it. Like, it's like, how could I feel so these opposite ends of this guy's work, one after it. Like, I can't think of another director where I went from truly loving one film and the next one truly hating. And I thought, you know, because I thought when I watched it again the other night, I thought, okay, maybe I'll have a better experience, and I really didn't. And I was curious, you know, because I really like what you wrote about it, but I think because the plot is so convoluted, I can't find myself getting emotionally invested in it. And I'm curious, do you find it that you can get emotionally invested in it, as even though it has this sort of convoluted plot?
Inherent Vice, oh, for sure. I mean,
It's interesting.
What I get emotionally invested in is the texture of nostalgia, and that what Doc has lost and what he wants back is not my nostalgia. I'm not Thomas Pynchon, you know. I'm not
right, of course,
for Gordita Beach in 1973, and I'm not nostalgic for, you know, the Vietnam War protests or whatever else. But the memory of the postcard in the rain and going somewhere with someone who you love and just being together, and then not only that being over, but walking back around the same corner later, you know, they put up a dentist's office, is it hurts, you know. I think that without having a lot of narrative emotion in it, because, you know, a lot of the interactions are very kind of wary and cool, and it's a private eye movie, and
yeah,
it's got so many moving parts. Plot,
it's kind of like watching The Big Sleep, which I also hate.
Oh, well,
People hate me that I hate it, but sorry.
no,
I love noir, but
people can love whatever they
yeah.
love whatever they love. I mean, the
Yeah.
bridging, the two bridging movies in this formula, your chess movies, Big Sleep to Long Goodbye to Big Lebowski, and
Right.
then Big Lebowski to Inherent Vice. And Inherent Vice has some of the shagginess of Lebowski, and also to some extent some of the taking the noir tropes and playing them as stars. Now the Coens on this front are far superior.
Oh, I agree.
Because noir is in their gut.
Definitely.
And because they have, I think in this case, not in all cases, because Anderson's Los Angeles is great, the LA of Lebowski, which has no responsibility to any reality, but just movie reality, is a perfect place.
Yeah, that's one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. It's brilliant.
One of the greatest screenplays ever written in the United States.
So good.
Not a line that isn't funny.
Right.
And right. I think Inherent Vice was billed and sold as having this wacky, Zucker Brothers or even Big Lebowski-ish kind of, countercultural energy. And it doesn't. It's more enervated than that. It's a little uneven. I do laugh every single time Benicio del Toro says anything. I think he's funny. And I think Josh
does have you. It's certainly, there were moments where I certainly did laugh. And I agree with you, this sense of, I thought the opening scene was brilliant. This, because I like a lot of what you said in the book about, again, that things change and relationships collapse, and it's inevitable, and it hurts. And that opening scene I love, because this woman that he loves, she looks different now. He can barely, she's dressing different, and he's looking at her with this sorrow that he's never seen before. And those close-ups, like on Joaquin, and then back to I'm sorry, I don't know the actress's name. Yes, brilliant. And those flashbacks in the rain, I loved all that, but it's just, the rest just drives me insane. Maybe I got to give it another shot.
It's sort of like the PTA movie for real heads, and I think that technically and pictorially it's as accomplished as anything he's ever made.
Definitely.
I find it pretty easy to watch, but I would also say that if you compare it to something like Phantom Thread, which is not really it's not any more compromised, and its conventionality is deceptive. But if you compare what you get emotionally maybe from Vice to Phantom Thread, while Inherent Vice is way more than a zero for me, Phantom Thread is much more potent. That to me is a top 2 Anderson movies. So,
well, it's interesting to me that because I watched it again the other night, and I just from watching other interviews with you, and I know you said that was a favorite of yours, of his, or your favorite of his. And at first I was surprised, because I see, again, that was a film of his that I thought it was all right when I first saw it, and I watched it the other night, and I really loved it. And I can see why I didn't at first, because and you had mentioned a critic who also I misread the film, because it's just right when Me Too broke. And I was having a hard time seeing a brand new film with a lead, one of the leads, Daniel Day-Lewis plays, being this mean and this controlling, and he's abusive to an extent. And when I saw it again, I can really see, like, it's actually her movie. This is like, she gradually finds ways, and it's very funny to take control, and it is a battle of the sexes. I thought it was so well done, and I think really it's saying something about relationships that I think are very true. As much as you love someone, they have a lot of flaws. You have a lot of flaws, and it is a constant battle, which is not always good, but sometimes keeps things interesting.
There's a reason why it's his most memeable movie, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I mean, I hesitate to call anything universal, and there's always, something perilous about calling, let's say, a period heterosexual romance universal. I mean, it's not. But there is something about those characters, about how their relationship goes and where it ends up and what they want and don't want out of each other, that I think a lot of people will find relatable if they can see past the surface.
Definitely.
Or if they
I
can,
could.
yeah, or if they can see past the mannered kind of period piece pretense of it, which is why in some ways it's one of his most practical, and I think for all of its perversity, it's really one of his warmest.
I agree. Yeah.
It sort of is basically a movie that makes you want to look at your partner and be like, okay, what can we do, but we don't want to lose anything. And that's all intersected in the film with all sorts of funny stuff about fairy tales and gender roles, comeuppance, and what does it mean to be cared for, things that are pretty rich.
Oh no, I totally agree. I know you have to go in a few minutes. One thing about the film I was curious about is, because of course it resembles Rebecca. Hitchcock's Rebecca was a strong influence. It's clear as day. And one thing that I was curious your opinion on this was that what do you think she saw in him outside of the fact that he was very rich and famous, and she was, as you said, it was the suggestion was that she's a Jewish refugee, and what do you feel her appeal to him was? I was curious. What do you think it was about this man that she was falling for?
I think it's about being in love with. It's about being in love with a brand, and also about being in love with someone who embodies these ideals and this accomplishment. I think part of what she's in love with is that she can see through it a bit too. It's the love of, I can fix him, or I can change him,
right?
I can improve in some ways on perfection. I mean, I think that
I like that she says to him, "You're not so tough," and she's right. Like, he really isn't.
No, and the degree
his sister even like cuts him down to size,
and the degree to which he's not tough, the degree to which actually he's a complete mama's boy kind of little catastrophe, right, is very funny.
Yeah, it's very much so. I was really.
It's an unraveling of these myths of masterfulness. Obviously, at the time and subsequent, Anderson has admitted had an autobiographical aspect, which is why I really, really like Licorice Pizza.
I still have to see it. I haven't seen it yet.
I don't have a but about it. I really like it, but I'll add an and it's a somewhat quizzical and, which is that it repeats the young, striving entrepreneur type character in the form of this kid played by Philip Seymour Hoffman's son, who's very appealing. And it also repeats the suffering partner aspect through Alana Haim's character, except that unlike in Phantom Thread, where Day-Lewis is much older, in Licorice Pizza, she's the older woman, right? And it's a different period, it's all that. But I was watching Licorice Pizza going, it's interesting that after Phantom Thread, he is now regressed back to idealized, romanticized 70s adolescence. I don't have a negative thing to say about the movie, not really. I think it's really lovely and really enjoyable. But not only is it not breaking new ground, it's kind of actively regressing back into the idea that being the coolest, hardest driving, most hustlingest kid around is kind of a triumph in and of itself. Be interested to know what you think when you see it. Very good film, and it's a pleasure.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it.
But something a little odd about what it's about versus what we seem to be getting at in Phantom Thread.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. Well, when you have your second edition, I'm sure. We'll get to your, a great essay on licorice pizza. But again, the book is Paul Thomas Anderson, Masterworks. I just want to praise your design team because the photographs and all the designs are so beautiful. I mean, it's incredible. It looks
That's very, very, very nice of you to say, and
it's so beautiful.
And all the consideration and space that you gave it, and by having me and asking me very informed and helpful questions. I appreciate it. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thanks so much for coming on. Where's the best place for people to follow you on social media?
Twitter at Bro From Another, and on the Ringer if you want to keep up with my writing. Okay.
Fantastic. Well, yeah. Well, I really enjoyed this, and please come again sometime.
As did I. It shouldn't be the last time. We can find something else to talk about. Thank you so much.
You are currently listening to this on the audio version of my YouTube channel and you've run out of episodes to listen to, head over to the YouTube channel where every single episode that I have ever recorded can be found. Go to youtube.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies. I also want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in supporting me over on Patreon and getting bonus content at the same time, head over to patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. And lastly, if this is your first time here on my YouTube channel, please consider subscribing by pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo. It's absolutely free to do so. You will see the logo floating above my head in your top left corner in just a second. Just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new videos. Thank you so much, everyone. I will see you in the next episode.